Hi everyone, and welcome back to this video about planning the cross-country macrocycle. In previous videos we talked about the entire year, planning from beginning, middle, and end, just sort of setting up the timing of it. And then in the last video we talked about the general preparation phase, or the first about half of your training year, why it's so important to set the foundation and everything. What we're going to start doing now with these videos here is looking at the specific workouts that we talked about in those, how to kind of generate them, why they're important, and how often to do them in the general preparation phase. And we're going to start with the most important one, VO2 max testing. This is where you're going to be setting your workout intensities for a couple weeks, something you're going to be doing fairly often. So I would recommend watching the other two videos first before this one, because this one really doesn't make it makes some sense in isolation, but it's building off of definitely things we talked about in those previous videos. So if you want to take a closer look at those ones first, I would definitely recommend that. I'm Kyle Giacono. I'm the head boys cross country and track coach at Wharton High School, and this will be now going into my my 7th year with cross country. I just completed my 7th year as the track coach at our school, and some of my other credentials are on the screen. So in the previous video, we talked about workouts that are important during the general, critical, important, and not important during the general preparation phase. And so what we're going to be looking at here today is VO2 max run, specifically testing, because there's two different types. There's going to be your general VO2 max workout that we'll talk about later, but I want to do the testing video first because it's what sets up the workout intensity for everything else that you're doing, and this falls under the critical category, doing VO2 max runs, specifically testing. These workouts are vitally important to success in developing the key factors needed for success in the 5K. Later videos we'll talk about VO2 max runs in terms of intervals, long runs, recovery runs. We'll talk about the important workouts, and we won't really talk about the not so important workouts. It's not that these are not important, it's that they are not important during the general preparation phase. They are important later on in the season when we want to develop acid. So I always want to make sure that we understand the metrics of the race before we start talking about it. If you don't know the race, what it takes to win it, what the race demands in terms of the energy systems, and you really are just flying blind. The 5K, a long study that was done by Ingham, first published in 2008 and kind of spelled out several different times from various studies, found that they were looking for who won different races, and they found that over a long period of time from a lot of different types of professional, semi-professional athletes, that whoever won the 5K 94.3% of the time had the better VO2 max, or the most developed aerobic system. They could run faster aerobically. It's not 100% because it's not only about the aerobic system in the 5K. There's a race strategies and things like this, but obviously this is the key indicator of success. That's almost as close to a guarantee as you can get in a 5K. Or in anything in life, I should say. So we want to figure out how to develop this, and so we're going to be testing the VO2 max to see where our starting point is and how we can improve it. USATF distance coaching curriculum says that the 5K is run at 97% of VO2 max, so this makes sense why this is so critical in success in the 5K, because it's almost at VO2 max intensity that you're running the 5K at, very, very close, 3 percentage points away. And in terms of energy supply, from Dr. Matter and Hartman, published in 2018, a groundbreaking study that looked at second by second where energy was coming from in a race, they found that the 5K, and these numbers have changed throughout time as our understanding of these races and everything has gotten better, as our testing has gotten better. So you may have seen these numbers a little bit different, but the 5K, they found that 4% came from the ATP and the phosphocreatine system. That 10% came from the anaerobic glycolytic system. These are the not so important workout types that we talked about previously that are important for 10% of the energy. So we don't want to ignore, but it's a timing thing. And then, not surprising, 86% of the energy comes from the aerobic system. But that's still only a B. We are eventually going to want to develop these other systems, but we're going to focus first on the aerobic system because it is the lion's share of the energy. So VO2 max, we talked about this very briefly, or we talked about this in depth in the previous videos. We're just discuss it very briefly. Why does VO2 max improve? This is the name of the game. If this is 94% success rate, and the workout that we are going to deal with here today are targeting two main things. Okay, more myoglobin and bigger mitochondria. Okay. So myoglobin developed by training right at VO2 max, or 98 to 101%. We're going to be testing their 100%, so this is right in this, due to forcing the body to operate right at oxygen debt. So the idea being is, this is a structure, it sounds like hemoglobin, right? Seems very similar. Hemoglobin carries the oxygen on your red blood cells. Myoglobin is in your working muscles, and it takes the oxygen off the hemoglobin on your blood and moves it into the working muscles. It kind of grabs it and says it's mine. That's how I always kind of think about it. Myoglobin, the working muscles take it off of the blood, and they do it at a maximum amount when you put it right at oxygen debt, very close to or right at 100% of your fastest aerobic pace, which is a couple different ways that we can test that. Now, in later videos, I'll talk about this a lot more. We're going to be running right at VO2 max, so it's not so important. But the reason why you have this window of 98 to 101% is that is right on the verge of your body not being able to get enough oxygen. Anything faster than it, and the energy is going to be coming from the anaerobic systems. So if you do not put your body right at oxygen debt, right at that point where it is barely supplying the energy with oxygen, it's not going to develop more myoglobin. If you go too slowly, say you go 95%, and your body's relatively okay, it's not going to think that it's in a situation where it has to develop more myoglobin because that takes energy, and energy is survival. You start running faster than this, the mile is run at a much faster intensity if you try to run that workout intensity for this, and your blood is going to be moving too fast past the working muscles to where it can't grab all of it. So again, it doesn't think that, or it's not that it doesn't think it's an oxygen debt. It just simply thinks that, well, it doesn't matter if I don't have more myoglobin. I can't grab enough oxygen no matter what. So that window is really important, and what we'll find out if we just talked about the 5K is run right at 97%, so it's a little bit too slow to train this, and we'll talk about how you can use 5Ks to sort of approximate this, but this is also why I would not, if you're getting ready for the 5K, run a ton of workouts that are dedicated to 5K pace, because it's just a tiny bit too slow. It's very close, but in the end, it's a little bit too slow. And the other training adaptation is you get bigger mitochondria. Now, these are aerobic adaptations from other type of thing, and you'll get these from this type of work too, from just running, but more aerobic enzymes, bigger left ventricle, increased muscle capillaries or blood vessels, more blood, and then red blood cells. This doesn't come from training, this is just getting older. And more mitochondria come from any aerobic work, general aerobic work. But the mitochondria will actually get bigger if they're put right at this oxygen debt too. So the idea being is mitochondria supply the aerobic energy for the working muscles. So if it's it's in the cell membrane of the mitochondria where it happens. It's a really interesting system where they're using hydrogen ions, which is actually produced by your anaerobic system, and it kind of slingshots it back and forth through the cell membranes several times. And the last time it goes through, it's where it creates the ATP that resupplies the energy for the working muscles. Bigger mitochondria means more surface area. Obviously, more mitochondria are good, but if you have more and bigger mitochondria, now you can produce more oxygen. You have more myoglobin. I can pull more oxygen into the working muscles. So this is a twofold thing. And this is really the choke point. Moving oxygen into the working muscles. Human body doesn't store oxygen for a couple of reasons. One, it's very corrosive. We wouldn't live very long if we stored oxygen. And also on top of that is hopefully we're in a situation where we never go more than a minute or so without oxygen. So this is the choke point since the body doesn't store. So we have to force the body to have more of these structures that moves more of the oxygen through the body, because that is the choke point. It's not like water that you can store for a couple days, or stored fat or calories that you can go weeks without food. Oxygen is the choke point in this type of work. So let's go a little bit further into this. Adaptations, the aerobic system take a long time. We talked about this a lot in the previous videos, but this is why you do these workouts first, because they take 20 plus weeks, because they're structural in nature. Building more myoglobin, building bigger mitochondria are changing body structures, and it's going to take time. So, just very, very briefly to talk about this, VO2 max testing is ideal for setting up endurance runners workouts because it allows the athlete to train at their current fitness level so they can adapt correctly, keeps easy days easy and fast days fast. We'll talk about how you can use this to set up workouts in the specific workout video that we do later on from these hypotheticals we'll talk about. But it's the idea of easy days are easy, fast days are fast, and the problem is a lot of times we default to too many of these medium days. These don't really get you all that trained. They're not fast enough to get the adaptations you want, and they're not easy enough to let you go long enough to get the adaptation you want. So that's what's really good about VO2 max testing. It allows the athlete to have small victories also throughout the microcycle or the week, or however you plan out your cycles. So that's why it's really important to have VO2 max testing set it up. You know, it's their current fitness level, keeps everything in the right place, and they can have these victories. A lot of times you'll have people that'll try and run things at goal pace, right? I want this kid, if it's a girl, to run 19 flat by the end of the season, or the boy to run, 16 flat. I'm going to train them at that right now. That can be potentially dangerous for endurance runners. It's much better for distance runners, for sprinters in track, and you will do goal pace at times with anaerobic workouts. But for endurance runners in endurance type workouts, it is potentially dangerous because it forces the athlete to train at an intensity they are not yet prepared for, and by their nature, endurance workouts are a lot of volume. So that's why it can be a problem in terms of injury or overtraining or that kind of thing. It forces them out of their ability at that point. You obviously want to force them out of their ability in some way, but doing it this way keeps it in the right intensity for that time. It's very draining physically. It burns a lot of glycogen. This is stored glucose, the primary fuel source for fast work, and it can damage the muscles by training too much, and it's just mentally it's very demanding and draining over time to do this. And the opposite here, it's disheartening for the athlete cannot hit their paces because they're not there yet. It makes more sense to build to that point, to train where you are there and work up from that point. So there are 4 main field tests for VO2 max testing, and then you can also sort of finagle it by doing 5Ks also that I'll talk about. So the 4 main field tests: the V-Hill protocol, championed by the legendary distance coach Joe V-Hill. Protocol is to run 1 mile to exhaustion and divide by 0.91. Dr. V-Hill, he did a lot of his stuff at altitude, so I think that's why this worked great for him when he was training athletes. So doing it at a mile works great when you're at altitude. I'm at Tampa, Florida. We're at sea level. Most of the country is not at the type of elevation that he was working with. So I would say this is fantastic for mid-distance runners, kids that are not going to be able to do these longer type races, and for less trained athletes, but it should be used sparingly, right? Because this is not truly testing their VO2 max. It's testing what is, faster than their VO2 max and then getting an approximation. The actual best test in a field is this test right here, the Birchford protocol, is to run 10 minutes to exhaustion. 10 minutes is typically considered your VO2 max. How far can you go in 10 minutes? To exhaustion, and then figuring out the pace. This is great if you have a small group, a middle school group, you're training yourself, you have a couple athletes. This is a nightmare if you've got about 20, 25, 30 kids or something. If you're training a high school group, it can become a nightmare to try and figure out, okay, you stop there, you've got a GPS watch so you're good, but actually you didn't stop it in time. It becomes a bit of a nightmare, but it's actually the most accurate. The one that I recommend for most high schools is the Ashton protocol, which is 2 miles. You can also do it in the 3K if you want to kind of build people to this. Maybe you've got runners that they're not going to be able to run even a 3K, in under, say, 15 minutes, and you might want to kind of build them up to a 2 mile as sort of a small victory. You can do that too. It's very close. But the main protocol is 2 miles to exhaustion and figure out the pace, okay, from that. And I'll show you how to do that exactly in a little bit. Recommend it for high school teams. The Taylor protocol, I do not recommend this, but it is one that is used for 400-meter runners, maybe moving up. Maybe they're trying to run cross-country for their first time, and you're trying to get a starting point on them. The Taylor protocol is you take their date, pace, exhaustive 400 meters, so 400 as fast as you can, 65% of it, okay? So it might be recommended, I said, for a 400-meter person moving up as a starting point to first start building their aerobic system, because you have to have a starting point, right? This should not be something that's done with somebody that's midway through a cross-country season or coming back after running a couple cross-country seasons. I personally do not like this protocol very much, and I'll show you why when we pull this up. Gives you working VO2 max to set up workout paces. And we'll talk about setting up workout paces a little bit later. All of these should be done every 2 to 3 weeks. We talked about training them at their current fitness in a previous slide. They're going to develop, they're going to adapt. Adaptation takes 2 to 4 weeks. So you're going to want to do this every 2 to 3 weeks as the athlete adapts to keep the intensity in the right level so VO2 max improves. If you keep everybody at their first test for 6-7 weeks, well, they're not going to be at the right training target for that point because they have changed. This is the idea of importance of myoglobin training and that kind of thing we talked about later on. So whatever you choose to do it relatively often. You are not wasting a day by doing this. These are some of the best workouts you can get from your kid. So here's a hypothetical estrogen protocol. So let's say you're going to do the test. You've got your group of kids. You start with a great warm up, good dynamic stretches, drills and strides, and all that. Run your 2 miles best pace, and let's say you've got a pretty good high school boy, or a decent high school boy, or you've got a fantastic high school girl, and they run 10:30. The way that you figure out what their current VO2 max pace is you find their mile pace, resulting in a VO2 max of 5:15, half of the 2 mile pace. That is their current VO2 max, or the velocity. The little v here, when you see this in front of it, is the velocity at which they reach VO2 max. So that's what we're actually talking about here. Now let's look at the VHO protocol. This gets a little bit more interesting in terms of calculating it out. So you do the same thing. You're having a good warm-up routine, dynamic stretches, all that stuff. You run your 1 mile best pace to exhaustion. And I will say, I've only done this. I only do this maybe the first 2 or 3 times with your baby type runners. Your ones that are brand new to it. They come out to you the first time and they say, I wanted to try something in high school and I wanted to do cross country. Well, how much running have you been doing? I run maybe once a week, a little bit here and there. That's a kid that might be good for this. Or you've got that fantastic 800-meter kid. They spent the whole summer doing maybe club meets or something like that, and you're trying to work them back into it. But this is something that should also be done sparingly. But if you do decide to do it, let's say that you have a boy that results in a 4:55, or again, a fantastic high school girl. The way that you look at it then, you need to get 91% of that pace. So the way that you can do it, and there are websites that'll do this for you, but if you want to do the math based on simply this, you get the number of seconds you have in 4:55, so 4 times 60 plus 55, we're dealing with 295 seconds. And we're going to divide that by 0.91. You get 324 seconds. This person that ran 4:55, it has a VO2 max of 5:24 date pace. And that makes sense because, if you just think about what is harder to do, it's harder to run 10:30 than to run 4:55. This is a better, more developed aerobic system than if you run 4:55, if that kind of makes sense, because this is 5:24 versus 5:15. The person that does this is in better shape aerobically, okay, as you're looking at this. So let's look at a couple of the other protocols. The Birchford protocol. This one is pretty easy in terms of once you actually get the results. So you've got that is not right at all. This is the Birchford protocol. I should have changed that beforehand, but you got your 10 miles. Best effort results, let's say that they travel 1.75 miles in their 10 minutes. You're going to find that they have a mile pace at that point at 5:53. That is their date pace. So that's why it's a lot more simple. Once you have the results themselves, you just figure out what the pace is for the distance travel. Pretty simple there. Great test if you can manage it with the group you have. Taylor protocol, and again, I didn't do it here either. This is not the VHO protocol, this is the Taylor protocol, but start with a good warm-up, everything before. And this is where you're going to see why this is not my favorite test and should only be done as a starting point. Say you run a 400 meters best pace, and you have a kid that comes in 50 seconds. Pretty good high school boy. I mean, very good. I mean, they're probably going to get through the regional meet with that time. To find 65% of it, you do kind of the same thing that we talked about with the VHO protocol. 65% of it, you got 50 seconds. You're going to divide it by 0.65. You get 77 seconds, resulting in a VO2 max of 5:09 date pace, and you can probably see why this can set you up for having an issue. Again, this is a commonly used protocol for this type of athlete. I do not like this protocol at all, because if you think about it, a kid that can run 50 seconds in the 400, this test is suggesting that this person is in better aerobic shape than that kid that ran 10:30, or that kid that ran 4:55, or this kid that ran 0.75 miles in 10 minutes. Again, I would really just use this as a starting point, maybe once or twice as you're trying to work a 400-meter kid up if you're trying to get them into a cross-country season. Move them up to the VHO protocol, the mile test, as soon as you can, and then hopefully get them into one of these other tests that are a little bit more important. So how would you do this if you had a 5K? Maybe you're doing a 5K in the middle of the summer. Quite often do it maybe on 4th of July or something like that, or early on in your training season. Obviously, you want to do the VO2 max test as much as possible. You can also kind of get away with doing it from looking at 5Ks here and there too, which I recommend doing when you just don't have another option. So let's say you have a 5K road race, like I said, on the 4th of July or something like that. So you got a 5K at best effort. results, let's say you have a fantastic boy at this point in the season. If it's in July, they run 16:30. That is 5:19 pace. So that is 97% of their VO2 max. So we have to go the other direction now because this is slower than VO2 max versus some of those other testing protocol. So we have to get the number of seconds. We've got 5 times 60 plus 19. We've got 319 seconds. And this time we have to multiply by 0.97 because we ran slower than VO2 max in this race, right? So this goes from 519 down to 310. That results in a current VO2 max of 510. So that's if you have a road race, and I'll explain that in a second. So maybe you've got a cross-country race. Maybe you just got one that early on in the season, and you're still considering, you know, this general prep or whatever, and you're going through it. You got your same thing, 5K best effort. For the sake of simplicity, I'll show you why I picked 17:10 on this one. That is 5:32 pace, but because cross country is run on a very different terrain than a road, the generally accepted conversion from cross country on a fair course, and this is where sort of the caveats come into here in a second, is 40 seconds, right? So generally accepted, you've got a fair cross country race. You take 17:10, you're going to subtract 40 seconds, and we're back at our time of 16:30. So essentially, 16:30 road race, 17:10 cross country. It's basically the same thing. This accounts, as I mentioned, for the slower terrain. And we have to do the same thing. We have to find 97% of it. So we're going to come out to the same number because it's still 5 times 60 plus 19 because this is the same pace as before. So we're dealing with the 519. I should have put that over here too. Times 0.97. We result in a VVO2 max of 510. So a cross country 1710. Same thing as a 1630 in a road race. But here's where the caveats come in, the little asterisks and what's down here. This is not exact. Okay, we are dealing with a couple of variables here that the coach is going to have to project out. Okay, so this is your obvious, you're going to understand this, the course and everything as you look at it. So the questions you need to ask yourself, is this a fair road course or cross-country course? Fair meaning, is it normal, right? Or is it a fast course or a slow course? And we all know what that means when we're dealing with cross-country. Do you suspect it's short or long and you have to make different sort of accommodations for it? This is the two protocol for 5K road race and 5K XC. If everything is 100% fair, it is 5K, it is fair, it's relatively flat, there's no big hills in it, it's not downhill or something like that. Those are all the things that you have to take a look at. So like, for example, we have a race during our cross-country season that we almost always go to in Northport. It is on campus. There's, you know, concrete, there's asphalt, probably about a mile or so of it to where you can't run in cross-country spikes, which obviously takes away some of the speed, but it doesn't account for the fact that it's all this hard surface, making it sort of, to me, having looked at it, having kids run on it for years, in between a fair cross-country course and a true road course, because there's still a lot of grass on it that slows them down. So what I always do, if I want to use that race to kind of approximate their VO2 max, is I do the same thing over here, but I only subtract 20 seconds from it. So I kind of hybridize it. Maybe you've got a 5K road course that you just know it's a hard course. It's uphill. There's a lot of rolling hills or something like that. You may have to make other adjustments to it. Road course, basically the same thing as if you're doing it on a track. There are conversions you can look at that it's usually about 1 to 2%, maybe even up to 3% slower if you're doing it on a road. Those are some generally accepted things. This is the way I've always done it, just for simplicity's sake, as you're kind of going through it throughout it. So those are the questions you have to ask yourself if you're using some of these protocol, and I certainly do this as I go through the season myself. So let's go ahead and take a look at how this might look on a fictitious macro cycle. So I've shown this in the previous videos. Our general prep is the longest part of the season, so this is a fictitious, this is just an example in a perfect world with our calendar in Florida with a state meet on November 7th. So that's where this is all projected to. Obviously, we can't work with kids a lot of places right now because of the coronavirus lockdown, so this is simply a fictitious macro cycle that you can adapt to your situation, the time frame you have, but this builds up to 23 weeks of training before the state meet, and we've talked about that in previous videos, why that's important. So the idea being is they have a transitionary week where they're just doing some easy stuff on their own here in May, no VO2 max testing in here. Then you get to June, first VO2 max, kind of showed it too fast, so we've got the transition week. They're going to come back to you and hypothetically start working in the first week of general prep. which is this week here. So they're going to have a week worth of workouts that are just sort of by feel. You're getting them back on their feet before you want to VO2 max test them. I've done it in years past where I do it day one, boom, get them a VO2 max test, or maybe somewhere in and around here. I've kind of changed that just a little bit because I'm typically at this point of the year especially dealing with not new kids coming in just yet. I can kind of approximate where they should be. They know the different cues for different training intensities. They can get through a week before you give them this. And if you do it in the first week, you're going to probably have to come back and do it. If you did a VO2 max test here, you'd probably want to redo it again right here because they just got to get back used to racing. You might not get a very accurate read if you do it day one of week one. So that's why I do it here. I've got 3,200 meter. You could do a 1,600 meter. Probably not with a lot of this with a 25-minute cool down, and then I'm going to come back and do it. The first one in between is still always going to be a little bit shorter. I'm going to do it here for simplicity's sake and sort of other things that we're dealing in and around the calendar, so that's how it would work. You could easily have done it here on the 29th. I just like to make between 1 and 2 no matter when I do these a little bit closer because they're going to adapt more. They're getting adjusted to the heat, adjusted to more intensity, all that type of stuff. So you might want to kind of do that here. So one thing I do change with the VO2 max test, I always do a long cool down. The volume on these days is always inherently a little bit slow. You're only doing 2 miles. You've got your mile warm up. 25 minutes on the first week is going to get them to about maybe 3 miles at this point. So you're dealing with a 6-mile day here. 6-mile day here. And then as they get a little bit more in shape, I usually change it to a 35-minute cool down, which is more like 4 miles. So it becomes more of a 7-mile day here. As you're doing it, you got to build volume, and these are some of the ways you can do it. This would be at easy intensity. We'll talk about that in some subsequent videos, looking at July. So again, I did that too fast. So we've got here General Prep 4, General Prep 5 is really mostly that first week of July. So boom, boom. So we had a VO2 max test here. So that's 1 week, 2 week. It's still pretty close together. You don't want to go very far without doing it. 2 to 4 weeks for adaptation. You want to make sure you're dealing with the correct running intensity. So we've got another one right here in July. Week 8, week 9, which would have been right here on the 1st of August is week 9, week 10. So again, we went 1 week, 2 week, 2.5 weeks. You want to put it that way, almost 3 weeks here. And the reason why I picked right here is this is our first week of school here in Florida, or hopefully will be at this point next year. So that's why I would do it like that. For us, you might change it to where now they're in enough shape to where you might push it to a full 3 weeks to get full adaptation out of that previous cycle, but that's how I do it. I don't really want to do it here. They've got a whole long week ahead of them of just getting used back to school, so I don't like to do a VO2 max test here. I like to do something else. And then we changed to specific prep, which we'll talk about a little bit later in videos. This would be a workout, a race, excuse me, not an important race. I would have my best kids tempo run at. So this is not one that I would typically do that whole conversion on. But if you've got brand new kids, it's their first race, let them go and you can retest them here. You might get some new kids and you do that first week with them here that we talked about previously to get them up on their feet, not giving them any real specific intensities. And this can be their first VO2 max test. Maybe they don't do so well because maybe it's the first 5K they've ever run. Well, that's okay because you're going to do a real VO2 max test on them right here. I don't have a meet planned on my macro cycle right here in the second week. I will have one here in the third week and a fictitious calendar. But that's kind of the idea of how you would do it. So we've got one here in specific prep 2, which we're really not dealing with quite so yet. We've got one here in the 10th and second to last week of general prep. We've got one here in week 7. One here in week 4, and one here in week 2. So we're getting 4 different VO2 max tests on them to make sure that we're always in the right training zone throughout the general prep phase. So in the next video, what we're going to do is we're going to change things up. We're going to look at long runs, what I think is the most important workout for the cross-country season, VO2 max being the second, very close to it. To me, in track season, when you're dealing with a 2-mile, they flip a little bit there. So we're going to look at long runs. I'll show you how to set up the workout intensity from the long runs from the VO2 max test. It's actually not that difficult to do. We'll come back with true VO2 max workouts in terms of intervals and how to set those up in a video after that and kind of go through that whole list of critical workouts, important workouts for the general preparation phase. So if you like this video, please think about liking or subscribing. If you have any questions, please ask them in the comments down below. If you found this helpful, please share it around. Also, if you found this or any of the other videos I've done helpful, the ones in the description down below or other ones, please think about subscribing. I took a look at the numbers on my channel, and right now, about 77% of the views are coming from people who are not subscribed to the channel, so I would love to get that number up. All you're really doing is showing sort of an appreciation for the channel. It doesn't obviously cost anything, and that subscriber really just kind of show like a backing for a channel so it can kind of get recommended for other people. So please consider doing that if you're somebody who's watching this and not subscribed. So until next time when we look at the long run video, this has been Coachy TV.